I'd never been to Iowa before, let alone stayed in a farmhouse all by myself. When my aunt asked me to house sit for her while she went on a 2-week cruise with her friends, I thought it'd be a nice change of pace from my cramped apartment in Chicago. I'd just finished my first year of grad school and needed a break from the city noise and constant hustle. The drive to my aunt's place took about 5 hours. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The farmhouse was huge, painted a faded white with dark green shutters. It looked like something straight out of an old movie, complete with a wraparound porch and a rusty weather vane creaking in the wind. My aunt had left detailed instructions on the kitchen counter. Feed the cats twice a day, water the plants in the sunroom, and make sure to lock up at night. Simple enough. She'd also mentioned that the house could be a bit drafty, so I shouldn't worry if I heard some creaking or rattling. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent most of my time reading on the porch, enjoying the quiet countryside. It was a nice change from the constant sirens and traffic noise I was used to. But on the third night, things started to get weird. I was in the living room watching TV and half dozing on the couch when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from upstairs. At first I thought it was just the house settling, like my aunt had warned. But these weren't random creaks or groans. They were distinct rhythmic footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. I muted the TV and listened. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. My heart started racing. I knew I was alone in the house. The cats were curled up next to me, and there was no way someone could have gotten in without me noticing. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any other sounds. Nothing. Just the usual nighttime noises, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I was in the kitchen, fixing a late-night snack. The footsteps started up clear as day, right above my head. It sounded like someone walking from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other, over and over. I stood there, frozen, a half-made sandwich forgotten on the counter. The footsteps continued for a good 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, the footsteps became a nightly occurrence, always starting around 11 p.m., always lasting for about 5 to 10 minutes. I started dreading nightfall, my nerves on edge as I waited for the familiar sound to start up. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal in the attic, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate for that. I even called my aunt, casually asking if she'd ever noticed any strange noises in the house. She laughed it off, saying old houses always had their quirks. Then, about a week into my stay, things escalated. It was close to midnight and I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The footsteps had already come and gone, but I was still on edge. Suddenly, I heard the distinct sound of a door opening and closing upstairs. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just footsteps anymore. This was undeniable. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening intently. For a few moments, there was silence. Then, the footsteps started again, but this time they were different. They were coming down the stairs. I don't know where I found the courage, but I forced myself out of bed. Grabbing my phone for light, I crept out of the guest room and towards the staircase. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel a presence, as if someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting. With shaking hands, I turned on my phone's flashlight and pointed it towards the staircase. Nothing. Just empty steps leading up to the dark second floor. I took a deep breath and started climbing, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. When I reached the top, I systematically checked every room. All the doors were closed, just as I'd left them earlier that evening. I opened each one, half expecting to find an intruder, but every room was empty. The last door I checked was to the master bedroom, my aunt's room. As I turned the handle, I noticed something odd. The door felt warm to the touch, as if someone had been holding on to it moments ago. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, but something caught my eye. On the hardwood floor right in front of the window was a set of footprints. They weren't dusty outlines or mud tracks. They were actual indentations in the wood, as if someone incredibly heavy had been standing there, staring out the window. I backed out of the room, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I ran downstairs, turned on every light in the house, and stayed awake until dawn, jumping at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. The next day I called my aunt again. This time I didn't hold back. I told her everything: the footsteps, the door, the indentations in the floor. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, my aunt sighed heavily. She told me that her late husband, my uncle, had suffered from severe insomnia in the years before his death. He used to pace the upstairs hallway at night, trying to tire himself out. Sometimes he'd go into their bedroom and stand by the window, watching the stars. She said she'd gotten so used to the sound of his footsteps that after he passed, the silence was almost unbearable. I listened, stunned. My aunt had never been one for ghost stories or supernatural beliefs. She was a practical, no-nonsense kind of woman. But there was a tremor in her voice as she spoke, a mix of sadness and something else. Wonder, maybe. For the rest of my stay, the nightly footsteps continued. But knowing their source, they no longer filled me with dread. Instead, they became a strange comfort, a reminder of a man I'd never met but who was still in some inexplicable way, watching over the house and the woman he'd loved. When my aunt returned from her cruise, I didn't mention the footsteps again. As I was leaving, she hugged me tightly and thanked me for staying. There was a knowing look in her eyes, and I realized that she'd sent me there for a reason, not just to watch the house, but to experience something she couldn't explain, but needed someone else to validate. I drove back to Chicago with a lot on my mind. I'm not sure I believe in ghosts, even now. But I know what I heard and saw in that old farmhouse in Iowa. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself listening for footsteps that never come. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now, the passing of my grandfather hit our family hard. He was the glue that held us together, always there with a warm smile and a comforting word. When he died, it felt like a piece of our world had crumbled. As the eldest grandchild, I volunteered to stay at his house and sort through his belongings. It was a task I dreaded, but I knew it needed to be done. I arrived at his modest suburban home on a chilly autumn evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. As I turned the key in the lock, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. The house smelled exactly as I remembered, a mixture of old books, leather, and a faint hint of pipe tobacco that seemed to linger years after he'd quit smoking. I spent the first few hours going through the living room, sorting through old photo albums and trinkets. Each item held a memory, and I found myself lost in thoughts of happier times. It was well past midnight when I finally decided to call it a day. I made my way upstairs to the guest bedroom, the same room I'd slept in countless times during summer visits. The room was exactly as I remembered it: floral wallpaper, a creaky old bed, and a small desk by the window. I changed into my pajamas and crawled into bed, exhausted from the emotional day. As I drifted off to sleep, I could almost hear my grandfather's deep, comforting laugh echoing through the house. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was suddenly jolted awake. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then it hit me, the unmistakable scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. It wasn't just a faint hint like before. It was strong, as if someone was smoking in the room with me. My heart started racing. I sat up in bed, my eyes darting around the darkened room. The scent was so vivid, so real. For a moment, I half expected to see my grandfather sitting in the old rocking chair by the window, pipe in hand. But the room was empty. I got out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. I walked around the room trying to find the source of the smell. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. I opened the window, thinking maybe it was coming from outside, but the cool night air carried no trace of tobacco. As suddenly as it had appeared, the scent vanished. I stood there, confused and a little shaken. My grandfather hadn't smoked his pipe in years before he passed. He'd quit when I was still in high school after a health scare. So why was I smelling it now so strongly? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a vivid dream, triggered by being in his house and surrounded by his things. Or perhaps the scent had been trapped in the curtains or the carpet and had somehow been released. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't quite fit. I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I started my investigation. I searched every nook and cranny of the house, looking for an old pouch of tobacco or a forgotten pipe. I found nothing. I even called my aunt to ask if anyone had been in the house recently, maybe smoking. She assured me no one had been there since my grandfather's passing. The day passed quickly as I continued sorting through my grandfather's belongings. As night fell, I found myself growing anxious. Would it happen again? Part of me hoped it would, if only to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. Another part of me was terrified of what it might mean if it did. I stayed up late, watching old movies on TV and trying to keep my mind occupied. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I headed up to bed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The digital clock ticked over to 3:16 a.m., and I held my breath. 3:17 a.m., and there it was again. The rich, sweet scent of pipe tobacco filled the room. This time I was fully awake, and there was no doubt in my mind this was real. The scent was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood, a mix of cherry and vanilla that my grandfather favored. I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The scent seemed to be strongest near the old rocking chair by the window. As I watched, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The chair was moving, rocking gently back and forth as if someone was sitting in it. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. The rocking continued, slow and steady, accompanied by the overwhelming scent of tobacco. Then, I heard something that nearly stopped my heart. The soft, familiar sound of my grandfather clearing his throat. It was a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before, usually followed by one of his funny stories or bits of wisdom. But now, in the darkness of night, in a house that should have been empty except for me, it was terrifying. I must have made a sound because suddenly, everything stopped. The rocking chair went still, and the scent of tobacco dissipated almost instantly. The room was plunged into silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, huddled in the living room armchair. When dawn broke, I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were concerned, suggesting that grief and lack of sleep were playing tricks on my mind. They offered to come and help me finish sorting through the house, an offer I gratefully accepted. My parents arrived that afternoon, and together we tackled the rest of the house. As we worked, I debated whether or not to tell them about the rocking chair. In the light of day, it all seemed so implausible. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just grief and an overactive imagination. That night, with my parents sleeping in the master bedroom, I returned to the guest room. Part of me was afraid, but another part was curious. Would it happen again with other people in the house? As 3:17 a.m. approached, I found myself holding my breath again. But this time, nothing happened. No scent of tobacco, no ghostly rocking chair, no familiar throat clearing. Just the quiet of a normal night. The next morning, as we finished up the last of the sorting, my mom found something tucked away in the back of my grandfather's closet, his old pipe and a pouch of tobacco. They still carried a faint scent, but nothing like the vivid aroma I'd experienced those 2 nights. We finished packing up the house that day. As we were leaving, I took one last look at the guest room. The rocking chair sat still by the window, bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight. For a moment, I could almost see my grandfather sitting there, smiling his warm smile. I never experienced anything like that again, in my grandfather's house or anywhere else. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened those 2 nights. Was it a vivid dream? A hallucination brought on by grief? Or was it something more? A final visit? A last goodbye? I don't know. But sometimes when I catch a whiff of pipe tobacco, I can't help but smile and think of those strange, scary, yet oddly comforting nights in my grandfather's house. I had just moved to Seattle for a fresh start after a messy breakup. The city's gloomy weather matched my mood perfectly, and I was determined to make the most of my new life. I found a cozy apartment in an old building near downtown, with creaky wooden floors and large windows that let in what little sunlight Seattle had to offer. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and settling in. I was exhausted, but excited about this new chapter. That's when the strange occurrences began. At first, it was just little things. I'd put my keys on the kitchen counter only to find them on the coffee table later. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness, assuming I was just forgetful due to the stress of moving. But as the days went by, the incidents became more frequent and harder to explain. I'd leave my keys in my jacket pocket hanging by the door, only to find them in the bathroom sink the next morning. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was sleepwalking or if the stress was getting to me more than I realized. One particularly frustrating morning, I was running late for work and couldn't find my keys anywhere. I tore through the apartment, checking every possible hiding spot. Just as I was about to give up and call a locksmith, I spotted them peeking out from under the rug in the hallway. I was certain I hadn't been anywhere near that rug the night before. That's when I started to get really freaked out. I began to question my sanity. Was I losing my mind? Was the stress of the move and the breakup causing me to black out and misplace things? I even considered setting up a camera to monitor my movements at night, but the thought of potentially catching myself sleepwalking was too unsettling. The breaking point came about 2 weeks after I moved in. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard a distinct jingle. I turned around just in time to see my keys slide off the counter and onto the floor. There was no way they could have fallen on their own. The counter was perfectly level, and there was no breeze in the apartment. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't rationalize this away. I spent that night at a nearby hotel, too scared to stay in the apartment. The next day, I reluctantly returned, half expecting to find the place in chaos, but everything was exactly as I'd left it. I tried to go about my day normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Later that afternoon, I ran into my next-door neighbor in the hallway. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, who had lived in the building for decades. We got to talking, and I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself confiding in him about the strange occurrences with my keys. To my surprise, he didn't look at me like I was crazy. Instead, he nodded knowingly and said, "Ah, you must be in Margaret's old apartment." When I asked him what he meant, he explained that the previous tenant, Margaret, was an elderly woman who had lived there for over 40 years. In her final years, she had developed severe dementia and would constantly misplace her keys. He told me how the entire floor would often hear Margaret shuffling around at odd hours, frantically searching for her keys. Sometimes they'd find her in the hallway, confused and distressed. The neighbor mentioned that even after Margaret was moved to a care facility, the building manager would occasionally find her keys in strange places around the apartment. I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke. Part of me was relieved to have some sort of explanation, but another part was terrified at the implication. Was Margaret's spirit still in the apartment, continuing her endless search for her keys? That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of Margaret and her lost keys. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint jingling sound coming from the living room. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to hide under the covers, but something compelled me to investigate. I crept into the living room, my phone's flashlight illuminating the way. The jingling had stopped, but as I swept the light across the room, I saw my keys sitting in the middle of the floor. I was positive they had been on the hook by the door when I went to bed. In that moment, a strange calm washed over me. I don't know where I found the courage, but I spoke out loud to the empty room. "Margaret," I said, my voice shaky but clear. "I know you're looking for your keys, but these are mine and I need them. I'm sorry you lost yours, but you don't live here anymore." I felt ridiculous talking to thin air. But as soon as the words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. It was subtle, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. I quickly scooped up my keys and retreated to my bedroom, half expecting something to follow me. But nothing did. To my amazement, that was the last time my keys ever went missing. In the weeks that followed, everything remained exactly where I left it. No more mysterious movements, no more inexplicable relocations. It was as if Margaret had finally understood and moved on. I still live in that apartment. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear a faint jingling. But my keys stay put, and I've come to appreciate the strange peace I've made with whatever or whoever else calls this place home. I never expected a simple babysitting gig to turn into the most unsettling night of my life. It was a crisp autumn evening when my sister called, desperate for someone to watch her 5-year-old daughter Emily. With a last-minute work emergency, she needed help, and I was more than happy to oblige. After all, Emily was a sweet kid, and I figured we'd have a fun night of movies and popcorn. As I pulled up to their quaint 2-story house in suburban Connecticut, I couldn't shake an odd feeling. The place seemed different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Shrugging it off, I grabbed my overnight bag and headed inside. Emily greeted me with her usual enthusiasm, her pigtails bouncing as she hugged my legs. "Aunt Sarah, you're here. Can we play in my room?" I laughed, agreeing as I followed her up the creaky stairs to her bedroom. The moment we entered, I noticed Emily's demeanor change. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, and she whispered, "Shh, Ezra's sleeping." I raised an eyebrow, assuming it was just another of her imaginary friends. Kids her age often had them, so I played along. "Oh, I'm sorry. We'll be quiet then," I whispered back, winking at her. But Emily's serious expression didn't waver. As we settled in to play with her dolls, I couldn't help but notice Emily occasionally glancing at that same corner, sometimes giggling softly, or nodding as if responding to someone. I tried to brush it off, but a chill ran down my spine every time she did it. After about an hour, I suggested we head downstairs for dinner. As we were leaving the room, Emily suddenly stopped and said, "Ezra wants to come too. He's hungry." I forced a smile, feeling increasingly uneasy. "Well, Ezra's welcome to join us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. In the kitchen, I busied myself with making mac and cheese, Emily's favorite. As I stirred the pot, I heard Emily chattering away at the empty chair next to her. "Yeah, Ezra, Aunt Sarah makes the best mac and cheese. You'll love it." I set the bowls on the table, making sure to put one in front of the empty chair for Ezra. As we ate, Emily would occasionally push her bowl towards the empty space, giggling and saying, "No, silly, you eat it like this." I tried to engage her in conversation, hoping to distract her from her invisible friend, but she seemed more interested in talking to Ezra. After dinner, as I was washing dishes, I heard a crash from the living room. I rushed in to find a picture frame on the floor, the glass shattered. Emily was standing nearby, her eyes wide. "Ezra didn't mean to," she said, her voice trembling. "He was just trying to show me his family." My heart raced as I cleaned up the mess, telling myself it must have just fallen on its own. But as I picked up the frame, I noticed the photo inside. It was an old sepia-toned image of a family dressed in what looked like 1920s clothing. In the center was a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, with a solemn expression. "That's Ezra," Emily said, pointing at the boy in the photo. "He says that's his mommy and daddy." My blood ran cold. How could she know that? I quickly put the photo away, trying to calm my nerves. As bedtime approached, Emily became increasingly agitated. "But Ezra doesn't want to be alone," she protested as I tucked her in. "He's scared of the dark." I reassured her that everything would be fine and left a nightlight on before heading to the guest room. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the old house had me on edge. Around 2 a.m., I heard Emily's voice from down the hall. Concerned, I crept to her room and peeked inside. What I saw made my heart stop. Emily was sitting up in bed, talking animatedly to what appeared to be empty space. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw a faint, shimmering outline of a young boy in old-fashioned clothes sitting on the edge of her bed. I blinked hard, convinced I was seeing things. When I looked again, the apparition was gone. Shaking, I retreated to the guest room and spent the rest of the night researching the history of the house on my phone. What I found chilled me to the bone. In 1924, a family had indeed lived there, the Caldwells. They had a son named Ezra who tragically died in a household accident at the age of 8. The next morning, as we ate breakfast, I cautiously asked Emily about Ezra. "He's my friend," she said matter-of-factly. "He's lost and scared. He doesn't know where his mommy and daddy went." I felt a lump in my throat as she continued. "He wears funny clothes and talks weird. But he's nice. He just wants someone to play with." I didn't know how to process this information. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as an overactive imagination, but the photo, the research, and what I thought I saw that night nagged at me. As I was pondering this, Emily suddenly looked up from her cereal, her eyes fixed on a point behind me. "Ezra says thank you for being nice to him," she said. "He has to go now. His mommy and daddy are calling him." A gust of cold air swept through the kitchen, making the hairs on my arms stand up. And just like that, the oppressive feeling that had lingered in the house seemed to lift. When my sister returned that afternoon, I didn't know how to explain what had happened. How could I tell her that her daughter had seemingly been communicating with the ghost of a long-dead child? In the end, I said nothing, convincing myself it was all just a product of an overactive imagination, both Emily's and my own. But as I was leaving, Emily hugged me tightly and whispered, "Ezra says goodbye. He's not scared anymore." I looked at her, then at the house, a chill running down my spine one last time. Whatever had happened that night, whether real or imagined, had come to an end. But the memory of it would stay with me forever, a reminder that sometimes the line between the world we know and the unknown is thinner than we'd like to believe. I've been working night shifts at Oakwood Pines Nursing Home for about 3 years now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and I've always felt a certain satisfaction in helping the elderly residents. The night shift can be eerie sometimes, with the dimly lit corridors and the occasional moans from restless sleepers, but I've grown used to it, or at least I thought I had. It was a chilly October night when everything changed. I remember it vividly because it was the night before Halloween, and some of the day staff had put up a few decorations. Nothing too spooky, just some paper pumpkins and fake cobwebs. I started my shift at 11 p.m. as usual, making my rounds and checking on the residents. Around 2 a.m. I was sitting at the nurses' station catching up on some paperwork. The night had been uneventful, with most residents sleeping soundly. I glanced up at the security monitors, scanning the different hallways out of habit. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman I didn't recognize was walking slowly down the East Wing corridor. She was wearing a pale blue nightgown, her silver hair neatly combed. At first I thought nothing of it. Residents sometimes got confused and wandered at night. I stood up, ready to gently guide her back to her room. As I approached the East Wing, I felt a sudden chill. The air seemed thicker somehow, and the usual hum of the building's heating system seemed muffled. I called out softly, "Ma'am, can I help you back to your room?" There was no response. I turned the corner into the East Wing, expecting to see the woman halfway down the hallway. But the corridor was empty. Puzzled, I walked its length, checking each room. All the residents were asleep in their beds. There was no sign of the woman in the blue nightgown. I returned to the nurses' station, my heart racing. I rewound the security footage, but to my shock, there was no sign of the woman on the video. The hallway remained empty throughout the night, except for my own confused wandering just moments ago. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and focused on my work, pushing the incident to the back of my mind. The next day I came in for my shift feeling a bit more settled. I had almost convinced myself that I had dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. As I was changing into my scrubs in the staff locker room, I overheard two of the day shift nurses talking. "Did you hear about Mrs. Abernathy?" one of them said. "Her family finally came to clear out her room today." "Oh, that's right. the other replied. It's been what, a week since she passed? I froze, my hand on my locker door. Mrs. Abernathy. I didn't recognize the name, but something made me listen more closely. Yeah, just about, sweet old lady. Always wore that pale blue nightgown, remember? My blood ran cold. I quickly finished changing and headed out to the floor, my mind racing. As I passed by room 217, I noticed the door was open. It had been Mrs. Abernathy's room, and a young woman was inside, boxing up some belongings. I paused at the doorway, and the woman looked up. Oh, hello, she said with a sad smile. I'm just finishing up here. I'm Laura, Mrs. Abernathy's granddaughter. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That's when I saw it. A framed photograph on the nightstand. It showed an elderly woman with neatly combed silver hair, wearing a pale blue nightgown. She was smiling at the camera, her eyes twinkling with warmth. It was her, the woman I had seen in the hallway last night. My hands shaking, I asked Laura if I could look at the photo. She handed it to me, explaining that it was taken on her grandmother's 85th birthday just a few months ago. I stared at the image, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. When did your grandmother pass away? Laura's eyes filled with tears. Last Tuesday. It was very peaceful in her sleep. Last Tuesday, a week ago. I handed the photo back to Laura, mumbling my condolences. I left the room in a daze, my feet carrying me automatically to the nurse's station. I sat down heavily in my chair, my mind reeling. I had seen Mrs. Abernathy last night, walking down the hallway. But Mrs. Abernathy had died a week ago. It was impossible. And yet, I knew what I had seen. The rest of that shift passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the security monitors, half expecting to see Mrs. Abernathy's ghostly figure again. But the hallways remained empty, the night as ordinary as any other. I never saw Mrs. Abernathy again after that night. I've run the events over and over in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I had seen her before she died, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was more tired than I realized and hallucinated the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. In the quiet hours of the night, in a place where life and death walk hand in hand, I had a brush with something I can't explain. The memory of Mrs. Abernathy's serene face as she walked down that hallway is etched into my mind, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. I still work the night shift at Oakwood Pines. Life goes on, residents come and go. But now, when I walk those quiet hallways in the dead of night, I can't help but wonder what other secrets these walls might hold. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I catch a glimpse of a pale blue nightgown out of the corner of my eye. I never expected my mom's death to lead to such a bewildering mystery. It had been 3 months since she passed away, and I was still struggling to adjust to life without her. Every Sunday, we used to have brunch together at her place, surrounded by the scent of her favorite flowers, purple hyacinths. She'd always have a fresh bouquet on the kitchen table, their sweet fragrance filling the air as we chatted and laughed over pancakes and coffee. The first Sunday after her funeral, I woke up feeling hollow, dreading the emptiness of the day ahead. As I shuffled to the front door to grab the newspaper, I almost tripped over something on my doorstep. To my surprise, there was a small bouquet of purple hyacinths, neatly wrapped in brown paper. At first, I thought it must be a mistake or maybe a final delivery from the florist my mom used to order from. I brought them inside, my heart heavy with memories. The following Sunday, it happened again. Another bouquet of purple hyacinths placed in the exact same spot. This time, I was certain it wasn't a coincidence. I asked my neighbors if they had seen anyone leaving flowers, but they all shook their heads, looking as puzzled as I felt. Week after week, the flowers appeared without fail. Always on Sunday mornings, always purple hyacinths, always wrapped in the same brown paper. It was as if my mom was still trying to keep our Sunday tradition alive, somehow reaching out from beyond. The thought both comforted and unsettled me. I started waking up earlier on Sundays, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the flowers. But no matter how early I got up, the bouquet was always there, as if it had materialized out of thin air. I even tried staying up all night once, but exhaustion got the better of me, and I dozed off around 4 a.m. When I jerked awake at 7, the flowers were there, mocking my failed attempt at solving the mystery. After 2 months of this bizarre routine, I decided to take more drastic measures. I bought a small security camera and set it up discreetly above my front door. The anticipation kept me up most of Saturday night, and I found myself constantly checking the live feed on my phone. Around 5:30 a.m., I saw movement on the screen and my heart leaped into my throat. An elderly woman I had never seen before was carefully placing the bouquet on my doorstep. She was small and frail-looking, with wispy white hair and a floral print dress that seemed out of place in the cool morning air. As she straightened up, she looked directly at the camera for a moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were kind, but there was something off about them. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I replayed the footage several times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this woman? Why was she leaving flowers at my door every week? And how had she known about my mom's favorite flowers? Determined to get answers, I printed out a clear image of the woman from the video and started showing it to my neighbors. To my frustration, no one recognized her. Mrs. Johnson, who had lived on our street for over 40 years and knew everyone, swore she had never seen the woman before. It was as if this mysterious flower bearer had appeared out of nowhere, with the sole purpose of leaving hyacinths on my doorstep. I decided to wait for her the following Sunday. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and positioned myself by the window, ready to confront her the moment she appeared. But as the hours ticked by, there was no sign of her. At 7 a.m., I opened the door, half expecting to find the usual bouquet. Instead, there was nothing but an empty doorstep and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. Confused and a little disappointed, I went about my day. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something odd. There, on my kitchen table, was a vase full of fresh purple hyacinths. I froze, my mind racing. I lived alone and I was certain I hadn't brought any flowers inside. How had they gotten there? I checked all the doors and windows, but everything was locked. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if the flowers had simply materialized inside my house. The sense of unease I had been feeling for weeks suddenly intensified. What had started as a touching mystery now felt like something much more unsettling. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with catching the mysterious woman. I installed more cameras, covering every angle of my property. I even hired a private investigator to watch my house overnight. But no matter what I did, the flowers kept appearing, and the elderly woman remained elusive. The PI was baffled. He showed me footage from his stakeout, where the doorstep was clearly empty one moment, and in the next frame, less than a second later, the flowers were there. It was as if they were blinking into existence. My life began to revolve around this weekly phenomenon. I couldn't focus at work, and my friends started to worry about my increasing paranoia. I found myself jumping at shadows and staying awake for days on end, fueled by coffee and the desperate need for answers. It was during one of these sleepless nights, about 6 months after the first bouquet appeared, that things took an even stranger turn. I was sitting in my living room staring blankly at the TV when I heard a soft thud from the kitchen. My heart racing, I slowly made my way there, half expecting to find the elderly woman standing among a sea of purple hyacinths. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. There on the kitchen table was my mom's old recipe book. It was open to her favorite pancake recipe, the one we used to make together every Sunday. The book had been packed away in a box in the attic since her death. I hadn't touched it in months. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I caught a whiff of a familiar scent. It wasn't the sweet fragrance of hyacinths, but the unmistakable aroma of my mom's perfume. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder, just like how my mom used to comfort me when I was upset. The next morning, I woke up on the kitchen floor, the recipe book clutched to my chest. There were no flowers, no elderly woman, no explanation for what had happened. just the lingering scent of my mom's perfume and a deep, inexplicable sense of peace. The flowers never appeared again after that night. No more mysterious bouquets on my doorstep, no more ghostly deliveries inside my house. It was as if whatever force had been at work had finally found rest. I never saw the elderly woman again, either in person or on camera. To this day, I can't explain what happened during those strange months. Was it all an elaborate hoax? A shared delusion born from grief? Or something beyond our understanding? I don't have the answers. All I know is that for a brief time, the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond seemed to blur, leaving behind the scent of hyacinths and the comforting memory of Sunday brunches long past. I was exhausted. The kind of bone-deep tired that comes from driving for hours on end, fueled by nothing but gas station coffee and the determination to reach my destination. It was late October, and I was making my way through rural Montana, heading to Missoula for a job interview. The darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of my headlights, and the winding road demanded my full attention. The radio had long since faded to static, so I was left with nothing but the hum of my old Ford's engine and my own thoughts for company. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:17 a.m. I'd been on the road for nearly 10 hours, and the monotony of the drive was starting to get to me. That's when I saw him. At first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure appeared at the edge of my headlights, thumb outstretched in the universal sign for a ride. As I got closer, I could make out more details. A man, probably in his 30s, wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a small duffel bag. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m., but something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the exhaustion clouding my judgment, or maybe it was the fact that I'd been alone for so long that even the company of a stranger seemed appealing. As I eased off the gas and started to pull over, I kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move, just stood there with his thumb out, looking straight ahead. I was about 50 feet away when it happened. He vanished. 1 second he was there, clear as day in my headlights, and the next, nothing. Just empty road and the thick darkness of the Montana night. I slammed on the brakes, my heart suddenly pounding. The car screeched to a halt, leaving me sitting there, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the spot where the man had been standing just moments before. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just sat there, engine idling, trying to process what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that my mind was conjuring up hitchhikers on dark roads? Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the car door. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, instantly clearing some of the fog from my brain. I stepped out onto the road, my shoes crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast emptiness around me. No response, just the whisper of wind through the pines that lined the road. I walked to the spot where I'd seen the man, my eyes straining in the darkness. There was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been standing there. I even checked the ditch on the side of the road, thinking maybe he'd stumbled and fallen. Nothing. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I hurried back to my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Part of me wanted to chalk it up to exhaustion and keep driving, but another part, a part I wasn't entirely comfortable with, knew that what I'd seen was real. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. As the spot where I'd seen the hitchhiker faded into the darkness behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just experienced something I couldn't explain. The rest of the drive to Missoula was a blur. I cranked up the radio, found a station playing classic rock, and sang along to every song I knew, desperate to keep myself awake and my mind off what had happened. I rolled into Missoula just as the sun was coming up, casting a pale light over the mountains. I checked into a cheap motel, fell into bed, and slept for 12 straight hours. When I woke up, the events of the night before felt like a dream. I almost managed to convince myself that's all it had been, until I went down to the motel lobby for some coffee. I overheard a conversation between two locals. They were talking about a stretch of road not far from where I'd had my strange encounter. Apparently it had a reputation. "Yeah, that stretch out by Lolo. People see things out there all the time," one of them was saying, "especially at night." I couldn't help myself. I approached them, coffee in hand, and asked what they meant. The older of the two men, a guy with a salt and pepper beard and weathered hands, looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You see something out there last night, son?" I hesitated, then nodded. "A hitchhiker. But when I slowed down to pick him up, he disappeared." The two men exchanged a look. The older one sighed. "You're not the first. That stretch of road has a history." He went on to tell me about an accident that had happened there years ago. A hitchhiker trying to get to Missoula had been struck by a logging truck in the middle of the night. The driver hadn't seen him until it was too late. By the time help arrived, the hitchhiker was gone. "Ever since then," the man said, "people have been seeing him. Always at night, always in the same spot. Some folks say he's still trying to get to where he was going." I listened to the story with a growing sense of unease. It fit too perfectly with what I'd experienced, but ghost stories were one thing. Seeing it with my own eyes was something else entirely. I thanked the men for the information and went back to my room. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd seen a real hitchhiker who'd just stepped off the road. Maybe it was all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. And I knew that no matter how many times I told myself it wasn't real, a part of me would always wonder about that lonely stretch of road in Montana and the hitchhiker who vanished into the night. I went to my job interview later that day, but my mind wasn't really there. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about the story I'd heard. I didn't get the job, but honestly, I was almost relieved. The idea of driving back down that road, of possibly seeing that hitchhiker again, was more than I could handle. I left Missoula the next morning, taking a different route home. It was longer, but I didn't care. As I drove, I couldn't help but glance at every hitchhiker I passed, half expecting them to disappear. They never did. I've never been back to that stretch of road in Montana. I'm not sure I ever will, but sometimes late at night when I'm driving alone, I find myself scanning the edges of my headlights, wondering if I'll see him again. The hitchhiker who vanished, still trying to reach his destination. I never expected my new job at the county courthouse to be exciting, but I certainly didn't anticipate it would turn into a living nightmare. Fresh out of college with a degree in public administration, I was thrilled to land a position as a clerk in the historic Oakville courthouse. The building itself was a masterpiece of 19th century architecture, all red brick and white columns, standing proudly in the heart of our small Midwestern town. My first day was a blur of introductions, paperwork, and trying to navigate the labyrinthine hallways of the old building. By the end of the week, I had settled into a routine, processing documents and assisting with various administrative tasks. The work wasn't glamorous, but I felt a sense of purpose being part of the justice system, even if only in a small way. It was during my second week when I first heard it. I was filing some documents in an empty courtroom, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. The clock on the wall read 3:14 p.m. As I turned to leave, a sharp sound cut through the silence, making me jump. It was the distinct crack of a gavel, as clear as if a judge had just called a court to order. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. My heart racing, I checked behind the judge's bench, thinking perhaps someone was playing a prank. Nothing. I even looked under the benches, feeling slightly foolish as I did so. The room remained silent and still. Shaking it off as a trick of my imagination, I returned to my desk. I didn't mention it to anyone, not wanting to seem like the jumpy new guy who couldn't handle a creaky old building. The next day, I found myself in a different courtroom, organizing case files. As I worked, I kept glancing at the clock, a knot of anticipation growing in my stomach as 3:15 approached. Right on cue, the sound of a gavel echoed through the room. This time I was ready for it, but that didn't make it any less unnerving. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every day at precisely 3:15 p.m., no matter where I was in the courthouse, I would hear the sound of a gavel. Sometimes it was faint, as if coming from a distant room. Other times it was so loud and clear that I could have sworn it came from right beside me. I started to dread that time of day, finding excuses to be outside the building or in the noisiest parts of the courthouse when 3:15 rolled around. But no matter where I went, the sound found me. It wasn't until the following week that I realized I wasn't alone in my experience. I was having lunch with Sarah, another clerk who had been working at the courthouse for a few years. As we ate our sandwiches in the break room, I noticed her checking her watch nervously. "Everything okay?" I asked. She gave me a tight smile. "Yeah, it's just... Do you ever hear anything strange around this time?" My fork clattered to the table. "You mean like a gavel?" The relief on her face was palpable. "Oh, thank God, I thought I was going crazy. You hear it too?" From that moment, a floodgate opened. It turned out that many of the courthouse staff had experienced the phantom gavel sound, but most were too afraid of sounding crazy to mention it. Some had been hearing it for years, while others, like me, only started noticing it recently. Theories abounded. Some thought it was just the old building settling, while others were convinced it was a ghost. A few even suggested it might be an elaborate prank by one of the judges, though no one could figure out how they'd pull it off so consistently. Driven by curiosity and a desire to put an end to the mystery, I started digging into the courthouse's history. I spent my lunch breaks in the archives, poring over old newspapers and court records. It was dusty, tedious work, but I felt like I was onto something. After weeks of searching, I finally found what I was looking for. An article from a local newspaper dated 1952 caught my eye. The headline read, "Respected Judge Dies in Courtroom Tragedy." According to the article, Judge William Hawthorne, a fixture of the Oakville legal system for over 3 decades, had suffered a massive heart attack while presiding over a case. The time of death was listed as 3:15 p.m. I dug deeper, cross-referencing court records with the newspaper article. Judge Hawthorne had indeed been a prominent figure in our town's history, known for his strict adherence to procedure and his trademark heavy-handed use of the gavel. He was described as a man who lived and breathed the law, often saying that he would die with his gavel in hand. Armed with this information, I shared my findings with my co-workers. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courthouse staff. Some found it fascinating, while others were deeply unsettled. A few of the older employees even remembered stories their parents or grandparents had told them about the stern old judge who died in the line of duty. As word spread, the atmosphere in the courthouse changed. Some people became obsessed with the phenomenon, gathering in empty courtrooms at 3:15 to experience the ghostly sound. Others went out of their way to avoid being in the building at that time, taking late lunches or scheduling meetings outside the courthouse. For me, the mystery only deepened. Now that I knew the history behind the sound, it seemed to take on a new significance. Was Judge Hawthorne's spirit still trying to maintain order from beyond the grave? Or was this some sort of cosmic echo, a moment in time repeating itself endlessly? I found myself staying late at the courthouse, poring over more historical documents, trying to piece together a fuller picture of Judge Hawthorne's life and death. I learned that he had been presiding over a particularly contentious case on the day he died, a dispute between 2 prominent local families that had dragged on for months. One evening, as I was reading through the transcript of that final case, I lost track of time. The courthouse had long since emptied out, the cleaning staff had come and gone, and I was alone in the archive room, surrounded by stacks of yellowing papers and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked up at the clock on the wall and felt my blood run cold. It was 3:14 p.m. How had it gotten so late? I had been sure it was only early evening when I last checked. As if in slow motion, I watched the second hand tick towards the 12. The moment it hit 3:15, the sound of the gavel rang out, louder and clearer than I had ever heard it before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room with its authoritative crack. But this time, it didn't stop at one strike. The gavel sound continued over and over, growing louder with each repetition. The papers on the desk began to flutter, and the lights flickered ominously. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to move, as the sound reached a deafening crescendo. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. Slowly, I became aware of my surroundings again. The papers had settled. The lights had stabilized, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. With shaking hands, I gathered up the documents I'd been reading and shoved them haphazardly back into their folders. I didn't bother turning off the lights or logging out of the computer. I just ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways as I fled the building. The next day, I submitted my resignation. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that courthouse again. Some of my coworkers tried to convince me to stay, to help them unravel the mystery further. But I'd had enough. Whatever was happening in that old building, whatever unfinished business Judge Hawthorne had, I wanted no part of it. I moved away from Oakville shortly after, taking a job in a modern office building in the city. Sometimes when it's quiet, I still find myself tensing up as 3:15 approaches. But the phantom gavel never sounds here. Whatever force was at work in that old courthouse, it seems content to remain there, punctuating each day with its spectral reminder of justice long past. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to tackle the daunting task of cleaning out my grandmother's basement. She had passed away a few months ago, and I'd been putting off this chore, dreading the emotional toll it would take. The musty smell of old cardboard boxes and forgotten memories hit me as I descended the creaky wooden stairs. As I sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, a small, leather-bound book caught my eye. It was tucked away in a dusty corner, almost as if it didn't want to be found. The faded gold lettering on the spine read, "Diary," in elegant script. Curiosity got the better of me, and I gently opened it, recognizing my grandmother's neat handwriting from the birthday card she used to send me. The journal dated back to 1962, when my grandmother was just 16 years old. I couldn't resist reading a few entries, feeling a connection to her younger self that I'd never known. Most of it was typical teenage stuff, crushes on boys, arguments with her parents, and dreams of becoming a famous actress. But as I flipped through the pages, something strange caught my attention. About halfway through the diary, my grandmother's entries took an unsettling turn. She began mentioning odd knocking sounds in her bedroom at night. At first, she dismissed them as the house settling, or maybe a branch tapping against her window. But as the entries progressed, her descriptions became more detailed and her tone more anxious. October 15th, 1962. The knocking woke me up again last night. It's always the same pattern. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 2 slow ones. I've checked every inch of my room, but I can't find the source. Mom and Dad say they don't hear anything. Am I going crazy? I felt a chill run down my spine as I read these words. It was getting late, and the basement suddenly felt colder and more oppressive. I decided to take the diary upstairs and continue reading in the comfort of my living room. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind kept drifting back to my grandmother's words. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling they'd left me with. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 2 slow ones. My eyes shot open, and I sat up, heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from my bedroom wall, the one I shared with the guest room. I got up, switched on the light, and pressed my ear against the wall. Nothing. Silence. I checked the window, thinking it might be a tree branch, but there were no trees close enough to my second-story bedroom. Unsettled but exhausted, I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, fueled by reading the diary. But the following night, it happened again. And the night after that. For a week straight, the knocking continued. Always the same pattern, always at night, always when I was alone in my room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes, or a neighbor's TV, or even a prankster. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I found myself drawn back to my grandmother's diary, reading entry after entry, looking for clues or explanations. As I delved deeper into her experiences, I noticed unsettling parallels between what she described and what I was experiencing. November 3rd, 1962. The knocking is getting louder. Last night, I swear I felt a cold spot in the room right after it stopped. I'm scared to tell anyone. They'll think I'm losing my mind. I couldn't help but shudder at the similarity. Just the night before, I'd felt an inexplicable cold spot in my room after the knocking ceased. It was as if the air had suddenly been sucked out of that particular corner, leaving behind a pocket of icy stillness. As the week progressed, the knocking became more insistent. It would start earlier in the evening and last longer into the night. I found myself dreading bedtime, my nerves frayed from the constant anticipation of those haunting sounds. I tried everything I could think of to stop it. I played white noise on my phone, wore earplugs, even slept on the couch one night. But no matter what I did, I could still hear it. 3 quick knocks, a pause, 2 slow ones, over and over again. My grandmother's diary entries grew more frantic as I read on. She described vivid nightmares, objects moving on their own, and a constant feeling of being watched. I found myself relating to her fear and confusion more than I wanted to admit. On the 7th night, things reached a crescendo. The knocking started as soon as I turned off my bedroom light. It was louder than ever before, seeming to come from all around me rather than just one wall. The cold spot in my room expanded, enveloping me in its icy grip. In a panic, I grabbed my grandmother's diary and started reading aloud from it, hoping to find some answer or solution in her words. As I frantically flipped through the pages, my voice growing hoarse from reading, something strange happened. The knocking stopped. Mid-knock, as if someone had hit a pause button on reality. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. The cold spot dissipated, and my room returned to its normal temperature. I realized I had reached the last entry in the diary. With shaking hands, I read the final lines. December 1st, 1962. The knocking has stopped. It's been a week of blessed silence. I don't know why it started or why it ended, but I'm grateful it's over. I'm putting this diary away and never speaking of this again. And just like that, it was over. The knocking never returned after that night. I finished reading the diary, and the strange occurrences ceased as abruptly as they had begun. There were no more cold spots, no more feelings of being watched, no more unexplained sounds in the night. I've thought about telling someone about what happened, but who would believe me? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the power of suggestion from reading my grandmother's diary had played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the visceral fear I felt, the undeniable reality of those knocks echoing through my room night after night. In the end, I did what my grandmother did. I put the diary away, tucked it into a box in my own basement, and tried to forget about the whole experience. But sometimes late at night I find myself straining my ears, half expecting to hear that familiar pattern once again. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 2 slow ones. I've always been a cat person, but after my longtime feline companion passed away, I found myself hesitant to adopt again. The emptiness in my apartment was palpable, though, and after months of coming home to silence, I decided it was time. I chose to adopt from a local rescue, thinking it would be a way to honor my previous cat's memory. The shelter was bustling with activity when I arrived. Cats of all sizes and colors peered out from their enclosures, but one, in particular, caught my eye. He was a sleek black cat with piercing green eyes huddled in the corner of his cage. The volunteer told me his name was Shadow and that he'd been found wandering the streets, clearly abandoned. Something about his cautious demeanor tugged at my heartstrings, and I knew he was the one. Bringing Shadow home was an adventure in itself. He explored every nook and cranny of my apartment, sniffing curiously and occasionally letting out a soft meow. I set up his food, water, and litter box, watching as he gradually became more comfortable in his new surroundings. That first night, he even curled up at the foot of my bed, and I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in months. It was about a week later when I first noticed something odd. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I glanced up to see Shadow staring intently at the corner of the living room. His tail was slightly puffed, and his ears were perked forward. I followed his gaze but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Thinking he might have spotted a bug, I got up to investigate, but there was nothing there. I brushed it off as typical cat behavior, but over the next few days I caught him doing it more frequently. He'd sit in the hallway, eyes fixed on a spot near the ceiling, or he'd suddenly stop mid-stride to stare at an empty space by the kitchen counter. It was unsettling, to say the least, but I tried to rationalize it. Cats have better senses than humans, after all. Maybe he was hearing the neighbors through the walls or picking up on subtle vibrations I couldn't detect. Then came the hissing. The first time it happened, I was in the bathroom, getting ready for work. Shadow was sitting in the doorway, and suddenly he let out a low, menacing hiss. His fur stood on end, and he backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off that empty spot. I felt a chill run down my spine, but again I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe he'd seen his reflection in the mirror and spooked himself. But these incidents kept happening, and with increasing frequency. Shadow would be perfectly calm one moment, then suddenly arch his back and hiss at thin air the next. It was always directed at empty spaces, corners, doorways, or sometimes just the middle of a room. I started to feel on edge in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see whatever it was that Shadow was reacting to. I considered taking him to the vet, wondering if he might have some sort of neurological issue. But apart from these strange moments, he seemed perfectly healthy and happy. He ate well, played with his toys, and still cuddled with me on the couch during movie nights. It was just those occasional, inexplicable reactions that had me worried. One night, about a month after I'd adopted Shadow, things took a turn for the bizarre. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. Shadow, as usual, had curled up at the foot of my bed. I fell into a deep sleep quickly, but sometime in the middle of the night I was jolted awake by an odd sensation. As I opened my eyes, adjusting to the darkness, I realized there was a weight on my chest. Shadow was sitting there, stock still, his green eyes wide and unblinking, but he wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on a point just over my left shoulder, and I had never seen him look so intensely focused. My heart began to race. The room felt different somehow. Colder, more oppressive. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, but underneath that was a strange, almost electrical silence. It was as if all the ambient noise of the apartment building had suddenly been muted. I lay there, afraid to move, my eyes darting between Shadow and the space he was staring at. Part of me didn't want to look, but a morbid curiosity was building. Slowly, ever so slowly, I began to turn my head. That's when I felt it. A sudden, intense cold spot, right where Shadow was staring. It wasn't just a draft or a chill. It was as if someone had placed an ice cube directly on my skin. The cold was so severe it almost burned, and I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. Shadow let out a low growl, a sound I'd never heard him make before. It was deep and guttural, almost primal. His claws dug slightly into my chest, not enough to break the skin, but I could feel the pressure of each individual claw. The cold intensified for a split second, and then just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The oppressive silence lifted, and I could suddenly hear the normal nighttime sounds of the building again. A distant car horn, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft whisper of wind outside my window. Shadow relaxed, his claws retracting. He blinked slowly, then calmly stepped off my chest and returned to his spot at the foot of the bed, curling up as if nothing had happened. I sat up, my heart still pounding. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp, half expecting to see something, anything, that could explain what had just occurred. But the room looked exactly as it always did. There were no open windows, no drafts, nothing out of place. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat up in bed, watching Shadow, who seemed perfectly content and untroubled. As the first rays of dawn began to peek through my curtains, I found myself questioning everything. What had really happened? Was it just a vivid dream, a product of my imagination combined with Shadow's odd behavior? In the light of day, it was easier to dismiss the incident. I went about my routine, went to work, came home. Shadow greeted me at the door as usual, purring and rubbing against my legs. That night, and for several nights after, nothing unusual occurred. But every now and then, I'd catch Shadow staring at that same spot over my shoulder, and sometimes, just sometimes, I'd feel a slight chill in the air, gone before I could really register it. I never experienced anything as intense as that night again, but the memory of it lingered. I still have Shadow. He's a loving, affectionate cat, and most of the time, he behaves like any other feline. But there are moments when he'll stop what he's doing, his attention caught by something I can't see. And in those moments I can't help but wonder what exactly it is that he's perceiving, and why of all the cats in that shelter, I was drawn to him that day. I've always been an avid solo camper, finding solace in the quiet wilderness away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Last fall, I decided to take a week-long trip to the Adirondacks, a place I'd heard so much about but never experienced firsthand. The promise of vibrant autumn colors and crisp mountain air was too tempting to resist. As I drove up from my home in Boston, the landscape gradually transformed into a tapestry of reds, oranges, and golds. The Adirondacks lived up to their reputation, and I felt a surge of excitement as I arrived at the trailhead. I shouldered my heavy backpack, double-checked my supplies, and set off into the woods. The first couple of days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I hiked through dense forests, climbed rocky outcrops, and set up camp each night under a canopy of stars. The solitude was refreshing, and I relished the opportunity to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. On the third night, things began to change. I'd found a perfect spot to pitch my tent, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As darkness fell, I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the day's hike. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something that made my eyes snap open. It was a whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. But there it was again, coming from just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. It sounded like someone murmuring, but I couldn't make out any words. My heart began to race as I considered my options. I was miles from the nearest campsite or trail. Who could be out here? I grabbed my flashlight and, after a moment's hesitation, unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice was met with silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been the wind in the trees or some nocturnal animal. The next day, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. As I hiked, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trails remained empty, and I tried to rationalize away my fears. That night, I made sure to secure my campsite more thoroughly, tying down my tent and creating a small perimeter with some twine I had in my pack. As I settled in for the night, the whispers returned. This time they seemed to come from multiple directions, circling my tent. I sat up, my sleeping bag clutched tightly around me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I barely slept that night, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The fifth day of my trip dawned gray and misty. I debated packing up and heading back to civilization, but a mixture of pride and curiosity kept me from leaving. I'd planned this trip for months, and I was determined to see it through. Plus, I wanted to prove to myself that I was just being paranoid. That evening, I built a large campfire, hoping its warmth and light would keep any unwanted visitors at bay. As the flames danced, I began to relax, convincing myself that the stress of solo camping had simply gotten to me. I even managed to chuckle at my own foolishness as I crawled into my tent. My laughter died in my throat when I heard it. A child's giggle, clear as day, right outside my tent. It wasn't just a sound carried on the wind or my imagination playing tricks. It was real and it was close. I froze, my body rigid with fear. The laughter came again, followed by the sound of small feet running around my tent. In a burst of courage or madness, I unzipped the tent and stumbled out, my flashlight wildly scanning the area. The beam caught a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing. For a split second, I thought I saw a small figure dart behind a tree. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the forest. "Who's there?" Silence fell once again, but this time it felt heavy, oppressive. I stood there for what felt like hours, my flashlight trained on that spot in the woods, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the cold night air forced me back into my tent, but sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening intently, but the night remained quiet. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was up and packing. My hands shook as I took down the tent and stuffed my gear into my backpack. I needed to get out of there, to get back to my car and drive far away from this place. I practically ran down the trail, my eyes darting left and right, searching for, I don't know what. About a mile from the trailhead, I nearly collided with a park ranger who was out on his morning rounds. He must have seen the fear in my eyes because he immediately asked if I was okay. Between gasps for breath, I told him about the whispers and the child's laughter. I expected him to dismiss my story or suggest I'd been hearing animals, but instead, his face grew serious. He asked exactly where I'd been camping, and when I told him, he went pale. 2 years ago, he said slowly, a family of 4 got lost in that area. Search and rescue found the parents and 1 child, but he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine. They never found the youngest, a little girl just 6 years old. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications of his words sank in. Without another word, I pushed past him and practically sprinted the rest of the way to my car. I threw my backpack in the trunk, jumped in the driver's seat, and peeled out of the parking lot. As I drove home, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a coincidence, that my imagination had run wild in the solitude of the forest. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard was real. Those whispers, that laughter, they weren't just in my head. I've never gone back to the Adirondacks, and I'm not sure I ever will. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think I hear a faint whisper or a distant giggle, and I wonder about that little girl lost in the woods and if she's still out there, searching for someone to play with. I never expected my son's innocent chatter to lead me down a path that would shake my understanding of reality. It all started when Tommy, my 3-year-old, began forming coherent sentences. We were living in a modest 2-story house in Bloomington, Indiana, a quiet college town where my husband and I had settled to raise our family. Tommy had always been a curious child, but his newfound ability to communicate opened up a world of wonder and eventually, unease. It was a crisp autumn evening when he first mentioned her. I was tucking him into bed, his favorite dinosaur pajamas barely visible in the soft glow of his nightlight. "Mommy," he said, his big blue eyes wide with excitement. "The nice old lady came again last night." I paused, my hand hovering over his blanket. "What nice old lady, sweetie?" "The one who visits me," he replied matter-of-factly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "She sits in the rocking chair and tells me stories." I glanced at the empty rocking chair in the corner of his room, a hand-me-down from my parents. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Kids have imaginary friends all the time, right? "That's nice, honey," I said, kissing his forehead. "Sweet dreams." But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Tommy's tales of the nice old lady became more frequent and detailed. He described her as having silver hair tied in a bun, kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and always wearing a flowery dress. What struck me most was his mention of a unique brooch she wore, a golden butterfly with blue stones for wings. At first, my husband Mark and I treated it as a harmless phase. We even joked about Tommy's vivid imagination, but as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the consistency of his stories began to unsettle us. One night, I was awakened by Tommy's giggles. It was 2 a.m. Concerned, I crept to his room and slowly opened the door. The sight that greeted me sent a jolt through my body. Tommy was sitting up in bed, facing the rocking chair, chatting animatedly. But the chair was empty. "Tommy?" I called softly. He turned to me, his face lit up with joy. "Mommy? The nice lady was just telling me about her garden. She grows the prettiest flowers. I flicked on the light, my heart racing. The room was empty save for Tommy and me. I checked every corner, even looked under the bed. Nothing. "Honey, there's no one here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Tommy's face fell. "She left when you turned on the light. She doesn't like bright lights." I sat on the edge of his bed, my mind reeling. "Can you tell me more about her?" And so he did. He spoke of how she would appear late at night, always sitting in the rocking chair. She never approached his bed, never touched him. She just sat there telling him stories about her life, about a time long past. He mentioned details that seemed oddly specific for a child his age, like how she talked about using a butter churn or tending to horses. The next day, I called a child psychologist. Dr. Simmons listened patiently to my concerns and suggested it might be an elaborate imaginary friend scenario, possibly triggered by Tommy's rapid language development. She advised us to neither encourage nor discourage these stories, but to monitor the situation closely. Weeks passed, and Tommy's nightly visitor became a strange sort of normalcy in our household. We'd hear him chatting away in the early hours, his voice filled with wonder and excitement. Despite Dr. Simmons' assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Mark was out running errands, and I decided to finally tackle the boxes of old family photos we'd been meaning to organize since moving in. Tommy was napping, so I settled on the living room floor, surrounded by faded photographs and yellowing albums. As I sifted through the memories captured on paper, a particular photo caught my eye. It was old, the edges frayed and the color faded to sepia tones. But what made my breath catch in my throat was the woman in the picture. She had silver hair tied in a bun, kind eyes with smile lines, and wore a flowery dress. And there, pinned to her collar, was a golden butterfly brooch with blue stones for wings. My hands trembled as I turned the photo over. In faded ink, it read, "Great-Grandma Eliza, 1953. I felt the room spin. Great-Grandma Eliza had passed away long before Tommy was born. In fact, she had died before I was even born. There was no way Tommy could have seen a photo of her. We hadn't unpacked these boxes since moving. Just then I heard Tommy's voice from upstairs. "Mommy, the nice lady is here again." My feet felt like lead as I climbed the stairs. I pushed open Tommy's door, the photo clutched in my hand. He was sitting up in bed, pointing at the rocking chair with a big smile on his face. "Look, Mommy, that's her. That's the nice lady." I held up the photo, my voice barely a whisper. "Tommy, is this the lady you see?" His eyes lit up. "Yes, that's her. See her pretty butterfly pin?" I sank to the floor, my mind struggling to process what was happening. How could Tommy know about a great-grandmother he had never met, never seen pictures of? How could he describe her brooch in perfect detail? Over the next few days, I showed Tommy more photos of great-grandma Eliza, mixed in with other family pictures. Without hesitation, he picked her out every time, always mentioning the butterfly brooch. I found myself diving into family history, learning things about great-grandma Eliza I had never known. She had indeed kept a garden, famous in her small town for its vibrant flowers. She had lived on a farm, churning butter and tending to horses. Every detail Tommy had mentioned lined up perfectly with her life. As suddenly as the visits had started, they began to taper off. Tommy mentioned the nice old lady less and less. The last time he spoke of her was on his 4th birthday. As I tucked him in that night, he said, "Mommy, the nice lady says she has to go away now. She says I'm a big boy and don't need her stories anymore." I felt a mix of relief and sadness. "Did she say anything else, sweetie?" Tommy nodded sleepily. "She said to tell you she's sorry for scaring you. She just wanted to meet her great-great-grandson." That was the last time Tommy ever mentioned his nightly visitor. He didn't bring her up again, and when asked, he'd just shrug and say he didn't remember much about her. To this day, I still don't have a rational explanation for what happened in those months. All I know is that for a brief time, the veil between worlds seemed to thin, allowing a great-grandmother to form a bond with her great-great-grandson, leaving me with questions that I suspect will remain unanswered. I'd always been a bit of a nomad, never staying in one place for too long. But when I landed a job at a tech startup in Burlington, Vermont, I thought it might be time to put down some roots. The city had a charm that was hard to resist, with its picturesque Lake Champlain and the Green Mountains looming in the distance. So, when I found a cozy one-bedroom apartment in an old Victorian house just a short walk from Church Street, I jumped at the chance. The apartment was perfect. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. It even came partially furnished, which was a bonus for someone like me who'd been living out of suitcases for years. The landlord, a friendly middle-aged woman named Sarah, seemed thrilled to have a young professional moving in. She handed me the keys with a smile and told me to make myself at home. For the first few weeks, everything was great. I settled into my new job, explored the local breweries, and even joined a hiking group. But then little things started to feel off. At first, it was just small stuff. I'd come home from work and notice that a book I'd left on the coffee table was now on the shelf. Or I'd wake up in the morning to find my keys hanging on the hook by the door instead of tossed on the kitchen counter where I usually left them. I chalked it up to stress and absent-mindedness. Moving to a new city and starting a new job was bound to make anyone a little scattered, right? But as the days went by, these little inconsistencies started to pile up. My coffee mug would be in a different cabinet. The throw blanket on my couch would be folded differently. It was like someone was tidying up after me, but I lived alone. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd had a particularly long day at work, debugging a stubborn piece of code that just wouldn't cooperate. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I barely managed to heat up some leftovers before collapsing into bed. As I was setting my alarm for the morning, something caught my eye on the nightstand. It was a small green plastic toy soldier, about 2 inches tall, the kind you'd find in those bags of army men kids play with. I froze, staring at it. I didn't own any toys like that. I'd never even played with toy soldiers as a kid. I was more of a Lego guy. Where the hell had it come from? I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It looked old, the plastic slightly faded and worn. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that someone must have been in my apartment, but nothing else seemed disturbed or missing. Just this single, solitary toy soldier placed on my nightstand like some kind of calling card. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lights on and even wedged a chair under my bedroom doorknob, feeling ridiculous but too freaked out to care. When I finally did drift off, I had the most vivid dream I'd ever experienced. In the dream, I was a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. I was sitting on the floor of a bedroom that looked exactly like mine. Same wallpaper, same worn hardwood floors, same antique dresser in the corner. But the room was filled with toys, especially toy soldiers. Hundreds of them, arranged in elaborate battle formations across the floor. I was playing with them, making little explosion noises as I knocked them over. But I wasn't alone. There was an old man sitting in a rocking chair by the window, watching me play with a gentle smile on his face. He looked familiar somehow, but I couldn't place him. As I played, he started telling me stories about the soldiers, where they came from, the battles they'd fought in. His voice was warm and kind, and I felt completely at ease. Just as the old man was about to tell me something that seemed important, I woke up with a start. Sunlight was streaming through my windows, and for a moment, I was disoriented. The dream had felt so real that I half expected to see toy soldiers scattered across my floor. But the room was exactly as I'd left it the night before, except for one thing. The toy soldier on my nightstand was gone. I tore the room apart looking for it. I even pulled the nightstand away from the wall, thinking it might have fallen behind. But it was like it had never existed. I started to question my own sanity. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I so stressed that I was hallucinating? I needed answers. I decided to talk to Sarah, my landlord. Maybe she could shed some light on the weird things happening in the apartment. When I knocked on her door later that day, she greeted me with her usual cheerfulness, but her smile faded as I started explaining the strange occurrences. "Oh dear," she said, her brow furrowing. "I was hoping you wouldn't have any trouble. I guess I should have told you about Mr. Winters." Mr. Winters, as it turned out, was the previous tenant, an elderly man who'd lived in the apartment for over 40 years. He'd passed away in his sleep about 6 months before I moved in. Sarah described him as a kind, gentle soul who'd never married or had children. His one passion in life had been collecting vintage toy soldiers. "He had hundreds of them," Sarah said, shaking her head. "When he died, we couldn't find any next of kin. Most of his things were donated, including his collection. But I always had this feeling that we might have missed a few soldiers here and there." I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered the toy soldier on my nightstand. Had it been one of Mr. Winters' lost soldiers? But that didn't explain how it had appeared and disappeared so mysteriously. Sarah must have seen the look on my face because she reached out and patted my hand. "Mr. Winters was a good man," she said softly. "If his spirit is still hanging around, I'm sure he doesn't mean any harm. He probably just misses his collection." I left Sarah's apartment feeling more unsettled than ever. Ghost stories had never really been my thing, and the idea that I might be sharing my space with the spirit of a toy soldier-loving old man was hard to wrap my head around. But as the days went by, I started to notice a pattern to the strange occurrences. They always seemed to happen when I was feeling particularly stressed or down. I'd come home after a rough day at work to find my favorite mug filled with steaming hot tea, even though I knew I hadn't made any. Or I'd wake up from a nightmare to find my blanket tucked more securely around me. And the toy soldiers kept appearing and disappearing, never more than one at a time, and always in places where I'd be sure to notice them. On my desk, by the bathroom sink, next to my laptop. Each time they'd vanish within a day like they'd never been there at all. The strangest part was that I started to feel comforted by these occurrences. It was like having a very quiet, invisible roommate who just wanted to make sure I was okay. I even started talking out loud sometimes, thanking Mr. Winters for his little acts of kindness. This went on for months, becoming a sort of routine. I'd have a bad day, come home to find a small toy soldier or some other sign that I wasn't alone, and somehow it would make me feel better. I never told anyone about it. Who would believe me? But privately, I started to think of Mr. Winters as a kind of guardian angel. Then, about a year after I moved in, everything changed again. I'd been pulling long hours at work, trying to meet a critical deadline. I hadn't been sleeping well, surviving on coffee and takeout. When I finally stumbled home after the project was finished, I was exhausted and emotionally drained. I opened my apartment door to find something I never expected. There, arranged on my coffee table, was an entire battalion of toy soldiers. Dozens of them, all different types and eras, set up in a complex formation. In the center was a folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, I picked up the note and unfolded it. In shaky, old-fashioned handwriting, it read, "Thank you for sharing your home with me. It's time for this old soldier to move on. Take care of yourself, young man." I stood there for a long time, just staring at the note and the soldiers. When I finally looked up, I noticed something else. The apartment felt different, emptier somehow, like a presence I hadn't even realized was there had suddenly vanished. That was the last time anything strange happened in my apartment. No more mysteriously moved objects, no more appearing and disappearing toy soldiers. Just me, alone in my space. I kept the battalion of soldiers, displaying them on a shelf in my living room. A reminder of the year I spent with a rather unusual roommate. I still live in that apartment in Burlington. Sometimes, when the stress of work gets to me or I'm feeling down, I'll look at those toy soldiers and remember the kindness of a man I never met. And somehow, it still makes me feel better. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.